The phone rang just as my father was cutting into his pot roast, the same disapproving scowl etched across his weathered face that had greeted me at every family dinner for the past decade. "Richard Brooks speaking," he answered curtly, his voice carrying that familiar tone of authority he wore like armor in his executive position at Pinnacle Manufacturing Solutions. What happened next would shatter everything he thought he knew about his supposedly worthless daughter sitting across from him at that very table. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mr. Brooks, this is Harrison Wade. I need to discuss something urgent with you about a potential acquisition offer we've received for your company. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, but carried weight that made my father's fork freeze halfway to his mouth. "The interested party is, well, it's someone you know quite well. My name is Natalie Brooks, and for 28 years I've been living under the shadow of my father's disappointment. Growing up in our modest home in Highlands Ranch, a suburb of Denver where perfectly manicured lawns mask perfectly dysfunctional families, I learned early that nothing I accomplished would ever be enough for Richard Brooks. While other fathers celebrated their children's achievements, mine seemed to find fault in every success I managed to scrape together. The pattern started in elementary school when I brought home straight A's, only to have him grunt dismissively and mutter something about how grades didn't matter if you couldn't apply knowledge in the real world. When I made varsity soccer in high school, he complained that sports were a distraction from more important pursuits. When I graduated summa cum laude from the University of Colorado with degrees in both business administration and computer science, he simply said it was about time I stopped wasting his money on fancy pieces of paper. But it was the family dinners that truly crystallized his opinion of me. Every Sunday evening, without fail, our family would gather around the mahogany dining table that dominated our formal dining room. The ritual was always the same. My mother, Catherine, would spend hours preparing an elaborate meal. My younger brother, Tyler, would regale us with stories from his job at a local automotive repair shop, and my father would hold court, dispensing wisdom about business, life, and success to anyone willing to listen. These dinners became my father's weekly opportunity to remind me of my failures. While Tyler received praise for his honest work and practical skills, I was consistently dismissed as someone who lived in theoretical clouds, disconnected from reality. My father had built his career from the ground up at Pinnacle Manufacturing Solutions, starting as a floor supervisor and working his way up to vice president of operations over 25 years. To him, real success meant tangible products, manufacturing processes, and the kind of hands-on work that built America's industrial backbone. My career in technology consulting seemed frivolous to him. When I tried to explain how I helped companies streamline their operations through digital transformation, his eyes would glaze over with barely concealed contempt. "Computers and fancy software," he would scoff. "When the economy crashes, people still need real products made by real workers. Your digital nonsense will be the first thing companies cut." The Sunday that changed everything started like all the others. I had driven the familiar route from my apartment in Cherry Creek to the family home, steeling myself for another evening of subtle jabs and outright dismissals. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and the leaves were turning those brilliant shades of gold and amber that make Colorado autumns so spectacular. I should have been appreciating the beauty, but instead I found myself rehearsing potential conversations in my head, trying to anticipate which aspects of my life would come under attack this time. My mother greeted me at the door with her usual warm smile, though I could see the slight tension around her eyes that always appeared before these family gatherings. Catherine Brooks had spent decades playing the role of peacekeeper, smoothing over the rough edges of my father's criticism while never quite having the courage to directly challenge his treatment of me. She loved us both, but her conflict avoidance meant that the toxic dynamic between my father and me had festered for years without resolution. "Natalie, sweetheart, you look wonderful," she said, embracing me in the entryway. "Your father's had a particularly stressful week at work, so maybe tonight we can keep things light." I nodded, understanding the subtext. Another evening of biting my tongue while my father used dinner conversation as an opportunity to highlight my perceived shortcomings. Tyler was already seated at the table, grease still visible under his fingernails, despite obvious attempts to scrub them clean. He worked hard at Morrison Automotive, and I genuinely respected his dedication, but our father's favoritism toward his practical career choice had created an uncomfortable dynamic between us over the years. "Hey Nat," Tyler said with a grin that held just a hint of smugness. "Dad was just telling me about this big contract Pinnacle landed with Denver International Airport. Sounds like business is booming. My father entered the dining room at that moment, adjusting his tie despite being home for hours. Richard Brooks was a man who wore his professional identity like a second skin, never quite able to separate the executive from the father. At 55, he carried himself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in most rooms, his salt and pepper hair perfectly styled and his posture rigidly upright. "Natalie," he acknowledged with a curt nod, taking his customary seat at the head of the table. "I trust you're still playing around with those computer programs of yours." The dismissive tone was immediate, setting the stage for what I knew would be another uncomfortable evening. But I had learned to navigate these waters with practiced diplomacy. "I'm actually working on a fascinating project right now," I said, attempting to inject enthusiasm into my voice. "We're helping a manufacturing company implement an integrated supply chain management system that could reduce their operational costs by 30%. Manufacturing, you say?" My father raised an eyebrow, and for a moment I thought I detected genuine interest. "Which company?" "I can't share specific client details due to confidentiality agreements," I replied, "but it's a mid-sized operation that's been struggling with efficiency issues. The preliminary analysis shows enormous potential for improvement." The interest vanished from his face as quickly as it had appeared. "Confidentiality agreements," he repeated with a sneer. "More corporate nonsense to make simple problems sound complicated. You know what improves efficiency in manufacturing? Good managers who understand their workers and streamlined processes that don't require a computer science degree to operate." Tyler snorted with amusement, clearly enjoying the familiar dynamic. "Remember when Natalie tried to explain blockchain to us last Christmas?" I think Dad's eyes rolled so far back they nearly fell out of his head. "Because it's all smoke and mirrors," my father continued, warming to his favorite theme. "These tech consultants come in, charge ridiculous fees to tell experienced professionals how to do their jobs, then disappear when their fancy systems inevitably fail. Meanwhile, companies like Pinnacle succeed because we focus on real results, not theoretical improvements." I felt the familiar frustration building in my chest, but I had learned years ago that arguing only made things worse. Instead, I tried a different approach. "Actually, Dad, a lot of manufacturing companies are seeing incredible results from digital integration. The data doesn't lie about efficiency improvements and cost savings." "Data," he scoffed, cutting a piece of pot roast with more force than necessary. "You can manipulate data to say anything you want. What matters is whether a company can deliver quality products on time and under budget. Pinnacle has been doing exactly that for 40 years without needing some consultant to tell us how to run our business." My mother attempted to redirect the conversation toward safer territory. "Natalie, how's Marcus doing? You two seemed happy the last time you brought him to dinner." Marcus Thompson was a fellow consultant I had been seeing for about 6 months. He was brilliant, kind, and understood the demands of our industry in ways that made our relationship feel effortless. More importantly, he didn't treat my professional accomplishments as threats to his masculinity or dismiss my expertise as theoretical nonsense. "He's doing well," I said, grateful for the change of subject. "He just closed a major deal with a healthcare network in Phoenix. They're implementing a new patient management system that should dramatically improve care coordination." "Another computer system," my father muttered. "When did we decide that every human interaction needed to be mediated by technology? Whatever happened to people actually talking to each other and using common sense to solve problems?" The criticism stung because it revealed the fundamental disconnect between my father's worldview and my own. He saw technology as a barrier to authentic human connection, while I saw it as a tool that could eliminate inefficiencies and free people to focus on more meaningful work. But explaining this to him felt like trying to teach calculus to someone who refused to acknowledge that numbers beyond 10 existed. Tyler, emboldened by our father's criticism, decided to pile on. "At least Marcus makes good money though, right? I mean, if you're going to work in made-up jobs, you might as well get paid well for it." "Made-up jobs?" I couldn't keep the edge out of my voice this time. "Tyler, the automotive industry you work in relies heavily on computerized diagnostic systems, inventory management software, and digital scheduling platforms. The only reason Morrison Automotive can compete with larger chains is because they've embraced technology to level the playing field." "That's different," Tyler replied, though he couldn't articulate exactly how. "We're still actually fixing real problems with real cars. We're not just moving numbers around on spreadsheets and calling it innovation." My father nodded approvingly at Tyler's comment, and I realized that this particular dinner was going to be worse than usual. There was something in his demeanor tonight, a heightened aggression that suggested he was working through frustrations that had nothing to do with me but would inevitably be directed at me anyway. "You know what your problem is, Natalie," my father said, setting down his fork and fixing me with that stern gaze that had intimidated me since childhood. "You've never worked a real job, you've never had to meet a production deadline with actual consequences. You've never had to manage people who depend on their paychecks to feed their families. Everything you do exists in this theoretical bubble where failure doesn't really matter because there's always another project, another client, another opportunity to start over." The words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully calculated to undermine not just my career but my entire sense of self-worth. I had heard variations of this speech before, but tonight felt different. Tonight felt like he was building toward something bigger, some final pronouncement that would crystallize years of accumulated disappointment. "Richard," my mother said softly, her voice carrying a note of warning that he chose to ignore. "No, Catherine, she needs to hear this." He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used in board meetings. "Natalie, you're 28 years old, and you're still playing dress-up in the business world."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
You think putting on a suit and carrying a laptop makes you a professional, but you've never actually created anything of value. You've never built something that lasts. You're what we used to call a hopeless case. The phrase hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning everything around it. A hopeless case. Those three words contained decades of disappointment, frustration, and fundamental misunderstanding about who I was and what I had accomplished. But more than that, they revealed something about my father that I had always suspected but never wanted to acknowledge: his need to diminish others in order to feel secure about his own achievements. I felt tears pricking at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break down. Instead, I carefully placed my napkin on the table and prepared to excuse myself from yet another family dinner that had devolved into a character assassination. That's when the phone rang. The sound cut through the tense silence like a knife, and my father glanced at the caller ID with annoyance. "Harrison Wade," he muttered. "My boss. This better be important." As he answered the phone, I couldn't have imagined that the conversation I was about to overhear would change everything. Not just the dynamic of our family dinners, but the entire trajectory of our relationship and his understanding of who his daughter really was. The man who had just called me a hopeless case was about to discover that the hopeless case he had been systematically undermining for years was actually the person who held the power to determine his professional future. But that revelation was still moments away, hidden behind a phone call that would expose truths neither of us were prepared to face. While my father spoke in hushed, professional tones to his boss, Harrison Wade, I excused myself from the dinner table and retreated to the kitchen under the pretense of helping my mother with dessert. But the truth was far more complex than anyone in that dining room could have imagined. As I stood there, mechanically arranging slices of apple pie on delicate china plates, my mind wandered to the empire I had built in complete secrecy from my family. Brooks Dynamics Corporation wasn't just another technology consulting firm. Over the past 5 years, I had carefully constructed a multi-million-dollar enterprise that specialized in comprehensive business transformations for mid-sized manufacturing companies. What started as freelance consulting work during my final year of college had evolved into something far beyond my wildest expectations, but I had deliberately kept every detail hidden from my family. The decision to maintain this secrecy hadn't been born from shame or fear but from a deep understanding of my father's psychology. Richard Brooks was a man who needed to feel superior, who derived his self-worth from being the primary breadwinner and decision-maker in our family. Revealing the true scope of my success would have shattered his carefully constructed worldview, and I wasn't sure our relationship could survive that kind of seismic shift. My journey toward building Brooks Dynamics had started during my sophomore year at the University of Colorado when I noticed a fundamental disconnect between what I was learning in business school and what companies actually needed in the real world. While my professors talked about theoretical frameworks and abstract models, I spent my evenings working part-time at a small manufacturing company in Boulder, handling their inventory management, and discovering firsthand how technology could revolutionize traditional business processes. The company, Alpine Precision Manufacturing, was struggling with efficiency issues that seemed insurmountable to their aging management team. They were losing contracts to larger competitors not because their quality was inferior, but because their operational systems were decades behind industry standards. Parts orders took weeks to process, production schedules were managed on paper spreadsheets, and customer communication relied on phone calls and fax documents. I spent months observing their workflows, talking to employees at every level, and gradually developing a comprehensive understanding of where technology could make the biggest impact. But instead of simply implementing standard software solutions, I began designing custom systems that addressed their specific challenges while preserving the human elements that made their company culture special. The transformation took 18 months, but the results were extraordinary. Alpine Precision reduced their production time by 40%, while improving quality control measures. Their customer satisfaction scores increased dramatically, and they began winning contracts that had previously gone to much larger competitors. Most importantly, employee morale improved, because the new systems eliminated tedious administrative tasks and allowed skilled workers to focus on what they did best. Word spread quickly through Denver's tight-knit manufacturing community. Other company owners began reaching out, asking if I could help them achieve similar results. By my senior year, I was managing consulting projects for 6 different companies while maintaining a perfect GPA and completing my dual degree program. The name Brooks Dynamics came to me during a late-night strategy session with Marcus Thompson, who had become both my closest collaborator and romantic partner. We were discussing how to brand our emerging consulting practice, and he pointed out that my approach wasn't just about implementing technology, but about understanding the dynamic relationships between people, processes, and tools within each organization. "You don't just fix problems," he had said, gesturing excitedly as we sat in my cramped apartment surrounded by whiteboards covered in workflow diagrams. "You identify the underlying dynamics that create those problems and then redesign entire systems to work in harmony. That's what makes you different from every other consultant out there." Brooks Dynamics officially incorporated 6 months before my college graduation, with Marcus as my business partner and chief technology officer. We started with a modest office space in Cherry Creek, deliberately choosing a location that would keep us far from my father's usual business circles in downtown Denver. Our first year generated nearly $200,000 in revenue, but I told my family I was working as a junior consultant for a small firm, earning just enough to cover my basic expenses. The deception wasn't easy to maintain, especially as our client base expanded and our reputation grew within the industry. We developed a methodology called Integrated Operational Excellence that combined process optimization, technology implementation, and organizational culture transformation. Unlike traditional consulting firms that parachuted in with generic solutions, we embedded ourselves within client organizations for months at a time, working alongside employees to understand their challenges and co-create sustainable improvements. Our breakthrough came during our second year, when we partnered with Rocky Mountain Aerospace Components, a struggling supplier for defense contractors. Their production facility was hemorrhaging money due to quality control issues and delivery delays that were threatening their military contracts. The company's owner, Janet Morrison, was facing bankruptcy and had hired us as a last resort. The project took 8 months and required us to completely reimagine their production processes, quality assurance protocols, and supply chain management systems. We implemented predictive maintenance algorithms that reduced equipment downtime by 60%, developed automated quality testing procedures that eliminated human error, and created real-time tracking systems that gave customers unprecedented visibility into their order status. The transformation was so successful that Rocky Mountain Aerospace not only avoided bankruptcy, but became one of the most efficient suppliers in their sector. Their story became a case study that we used to attract larger clients, and Janet Morrison became one of our most enthusiastic advocates, referring dozens of other companies to our firm. By our third year, Brooks Dynamics was generating over $2 million in annual revenue and employing 12 full-time consultants. We had developed proprietary software platforms that we licensed to clients, created training programs that other consulting firms wanted to emulate, and established partnerships with technology vendors that gave us access to cutting-edge tools before our competitors. But perhaps most importantly, we had developed a reputation for achieving results that seemed impossible to other consulting firms. While our competitors focused on delivering reports and recommendations, we took responsibility for actual implementation and measurable outcomes. Our contracts included performance guarantees that meant we only received full payment when clients achieved the improvements we promised. The success created a strange double life that I had to navigate carefully. At Brooks Dynamics, I was a respected CEO who gave keynote speeches at industry conferences and served on advisory boards for technology startups. I was featured in business magazines, interviewed on local television programs, and recognized as one of Denver's rising young entrepreneurs. But at family dinners, I remained the disappointing daughter who worked with computers and had never held a real job. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting, but I had convinced myself that maintaining the facade was necessary to preserve family harmony. I told myself that my father's approval shouldn't matter, that his opinions were rooted in outdated thinking about technology and business. The truth was more complicated. Despite building a successful company and earning the respect of industry peers, some part of me still craved my father's acknowledgement. I wanted him to understand that my work had meaning, that the problems I solved were real, and that the value I created extended far beyond theoretical frameworks and abstract concepts. Marcus often encouraged me to reveal the truth about Brooks dynamics, pointing out that my family's opinion of me was based on incomplete information. How can you expect them to respect what you do if they don't know what you actually do? He would ask during our strategy meetings in our expanded offices that now occupied an entire floor of a prestigious Cherry Creek building. But I always found reasons to delay that conversation. My father was set in his ways. I would explain. He wouldn't understand the nuances of what we did. The revelation would create more conflict than resolution. These excuses felt reasonable at the time, but I realize now that they were rooted in fear of discovering that even my actual achievements wouldn't be enough to earn his respect. Our fourth year brought the opportunity that would change everything, though I didn't recognize its significance at the time. Harrison Wade, the CEO of Pinnacle Manufacturing Solutions, contacted us through a referral from one of our existing clients. Pinnacle was facing serious competitive pressures from overseas manufacturers and needed to dramatically improve their operational efficiency to remain viable. The irony wasn't lost on me that my father's company was seeking help from the very type of consulting firm he regularly dismissed as useless. But I saw it as an opportunity to finally bridge the gap between my professional and personal worlds, to show him firsthand how technology consulting could solve real problems for real companies. Marcus and I spent weeks preparing our proposal for Pinnacle, conducting extensive research into their operations, analyzing their financial statements, and developing a comprehensive transformation plan that would address their most pressing challenges. We knew the project would be complex, requiring us to modernize legacy systems that had been in place for decades while preserving the operational knowledge and company culture that had made Pinnacle successful. Our presentation to Harrison Wade and his executive team was one of the most thorough we had ever prepared. We outlined a three-phase transformation that would reduce operational costs by 35%, improve production efficiency by 50%, and position Pinnacle as a technology leader in their sector. The financial projections showed that our fees would be recovered within 18 months through cost savings and increased revenue. But as we sat in that conference room presenting our vision for Pinnacle's future, I couldn't help thinking about my father sitting in his office somewhere in the same building, completely unaware that his daughter was proposing to revolutionize his company's operations. He probably assumed I was somewhere else in the city, playing with computers and contributing nothing of value to the real economy. Harrison Wade was impressed with our proposal, but he expressed concerns about the scope and timeline of the transformation we were suggesting. Pinnacle was a conservative company that had grown cautious about major changes after surviving several economic downturns through steady incremental improvements rather than dramatic overhauls. "What you're proposing makes sense on paper," Wade had said, leaning back in his leather chair and studying our projected outcomes. "But implementing this kind of change across our entire operation would require buy-in from every level of management. Some of our senior executives have been here for decades and have strong opinions about how things should be done." I knew he was referring to people like my father who had built their careers on traditional manufacturing principles and viewed technological change with suspicion rather than enthusiasm. The challenge wasn't just technical but cultural, requiring us to convince experienced professionals that the methods that had brought them success in the past wouldn't be sufficient for the future. "We understand the cultural challenges," Marcus responded, activating the next slide in our presentation. "That's why our methodology emphasizes collaboration and knowledge transfer rather than replacement. We're not trying to eliminate institutional wisdom but to augment it with tools that can amplify human expertise." The meeting ended with Wade promising to review our proposal with his executive team and provide a decision within 2 weeks. As we packed up our materials and prepared to leave, I felt a strange mixture of excitement and anxiety about the possibility of working so closely with my father's company without him knowing my involvement. That evening, I drove to my parents' house for our weekly family dinner, carrying the secret of the morning's presentation like a hidden weight. As I sat at the familiar dining room table listening to my father complain about consultants and outside interference in manufacturing operations, I wondered what he would think if he knew that his daughter had spent the morning proposing exactly the kind of transformation he claimed was unnecessary. The conversation that night focused on Pinnacle's challenges with overseas competition and rising operational costs, problems that I now understood in intimate detail thanks to our research for the proposal. My father spoke about these issues with the weary resignation of someone who saw decline as inevitable rather than solvable, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from offering insights that would have revealed my involvement with his company. 2 weeks later, Harrison Wade called to inform us that Pinnacle had decided to move forward with our proposal, but with a significant modification. Instead of the comprehensive transformation we had outlined, they wanted to start with a smaller pilot project focused on their main production facility. If the pilot succeeded, they would consider expanding our involvement to other areas of the company. The decision was both exciting and frustrating. We knew that limiting our scope would reduce the impact we could achieve, but we also understood that proving our value through smaller projects was often necessary to build trust with conservative clients. Marcus and I agreed to the modified contract, seeing it as an opportunity to demonstrate our capabilities and potentially expand into the full transformation later. What we didn't anticipate was how the pilot project's success would create a situation that none of us had foreseen. As our improvements began generating measurable results and earning recognition from Pinnacle's leadership team, Harrison Wade started considering more dramatic changes to the company's strategic direction. Changes that would ultimately lead to the phone call that interrupted our family dinner and shattered the carefully maintained boundaries between my professional and personal lives. But on that October evening, as I sat listening to my father dismiss me as a hopeless case, none of those future complications seemed relevant. I was simply a daughter enduring another night of criticism from a father who couldn't see past his own biases to recognize what his child had actually accomplished. The irony was almost unbearable, but it was also about to become irrelevant as the phone call that would change everything began to unfold in the next room. The conversation between my father and Harrison Wade stretched longer than anyone expected, with my father's voice alternating between professional deference and barely concealed confusion. From the kitchen I could hear fragments of their discussion that made my stomach clench with anticipation and dread. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wade, could you repeat that?" my father was saying, his tone suggesting he was struggling to process whatever information was being shared. "You're saying someone wants to acquire the entire company. How is that possible? We haven't been in discussions with any potential buyers." I exchanged glances with my mother, who was pretending to busy herself with loading the dishwasher while obviously straining to overhear the conversation. Tyler had abandoned any pretense of discretion and was openly leaning toward the dining room, trying to catch every word. "Who is the interested party?" my father continued, his voice taking on an edge of suspicion. "This seems very sudden, Mr. Wade. Just yesterday you were talking about the quarterly budget review, and now you're telling me someone wants to buy us out." There was a long pause during which my father's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching alarm. I could see him through the doorway, pacing near the dining room window with the phone pressed tightly to his ear, his free hand running through his graying hair in a gesture I recognized as his response to stress. "I see," he said finally, though his tone suggested he didn't see at all. "And you're telling me this person has the financial capacity to make a serious offer?" "Mr. Wade, with all due respect, Pinnacle Manufacturing is valued at over $50 million. This isn't exactly a small transaction." The number hung in the air like a challenge, and I felt my pulse quicken as I realized the conversation was heading exactly where I had both hoped and feared it would go. For months, Marcus and I had been quietly exploring the possibility of acquiring Pinnacle Manufacturing outright rather than simply consulting for them. Our success with the pilot project had given us unprecedented insight into the company's operations, and we had identified opportunities for improvement that went far beyond what traditional consulting could achieve. Brooks Dynamics had grown to the point where we were generating over $8 million in annual revenue, and our track record of successful transformations had attracted interest from private equity firms and venture capital investors who were eager to fund larger acquisitions. We had access to capital that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier, but I had hesitated to pursue the Pinnacle acquisition because of the personal complications it would create. "Who did you say the buyer was?" my father asked, his voice now sharp with focused attention. "Could you spell that name for me?" I held my breath, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether my carefully maintained double life could continue or whether everything would come crashing down in the most dramatic way possible. Brooks Dynamics Corporation, my father repeated slowly, and I could hear him testing the words as if trying to make sense of a foreign language. I'm not familiar with that company, Mr. Wade. Are they based here in Denver? The irony was almost painful. He was standing in the house where I had grown up, surrounded by family members who shared his last name, and he couldn't make the connection between Brooks Dynamics and the daughter he had just finished dismissing as a hopeless case. Cherry Creek, he continued, clearly writing down information as Harrison Wade provided it. And you're saying they've made a preliminary offer of $65 million. Mr. Wade, that's significantly above our current market valuation. What makes you think this offer is legitimate? I could see my mother's eyes widening as she processed the numbers being discussed. Tyler had given up any pretense of not listening and was now standing in the doorway between the kitchen and dining room, his mouth slightly open in amazement. They want to meet with me personally. My father was saying, tomorrow morning, Mr. Wade, this is all moving very quickly. I think I need some time to process this information and maybe do some research on this Brooks Dynamics company before we commit to any meetings. The mention of research sent a chill down my spine. A simple internet search would reveal my role as CEO of Brooks Dynamics, complete with photos from industry conferences and interviews. The carefully constructed wall between my professional and personal lives was about to crumble, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Yes, I understand the urgency, my father continued, his voice taking on the clipped, businesslike tone he used when he was trying to maintain control of a situation that was spiraling beyond his comprehension. But Mr. Wade, you have to understand that this is completely unexpected. Just this morning I was planning next quarter's production schedule, and now you're telling me someone wants to buy the entire company. He paused, listening to whatever Harrison Wade was saying on the other end of the line, and I could see his expression shifting from confusion to something that looked almost like fear. They've been consulting for us, he said, his voice rising slightly. What do you mean they've been consulting for us? I think I would know if we were working with an outside consulting firm. My heart was pounding so hard I was certain everyone in the kitchen could hear it. The pilot project we had been working on was conducted primarily through Harrison Wade's office, with limited involvement from other department heads. My father, as vice president of operations, would have been aware that improvements were being implemented, but Wade had deliberately kept the details of our involvement confidential to avoid the kind of internal resistance that often derailed consulting projects. They're the firm behind the efficiency improvements in Building C. My father's voice was now strained with disbelief. Mr. Wade, those improvements saved us nearly $2 million in the first quarter alone. You're telling me the same people who designed those systems now want to buy the entire company? I could see the wheels turning in his mind as he tried to reconcile his dismissive attitude toward consultants with the undeniable success of the improvements that had been implemented under his oversight. The cognitive dissonance was clearly creating stress, and I found myself feeling an unexpected pang of sympathy for him despite years of enduring his criticism. Natalie Brooks, he repeated, and my entire body went rigid as I heard my name spoken in his confused, increasingly agitated voice. The CEO is named Natalie Brooks. Mr. Wade, that's my daughter's name. The silence that followed was deafening. Tyler's mouth fell completely open, and my mother dropped the dish towel she had been clutching. Through the doorway I could see my father standing frozen by the window, the phone still pressed to his ear but his expression completely blank as if his brain had simply stopped processing information. Could you repeat that, please? He said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. You're saying the CEO of Brooks Dynamics Corporation, the company that wants to acquire Pinnacle Manufacturing, is a 28-year-old woman named Natalie Brooks who graduated from the University of Colorado. I closed my eyes, knowing that the moment I had been dreading and anticipating for years was finally arriving. There was no way to maintain the deception any longer, no way to pretend that the successful business executive Harrison Wade was describing was anyone other than the daughter he had just finished calling a hopeless case. She's here, he said, his voice sounding hollow and distant. She's sitting at my dinner table right now. The phone call ended abruptly, and my father stood motionless for what felt like an eternity before slowly placing the handset back in its cradle. When he turned to face the kitchen, his expression was completely unreadable, a mixture of confusion, shock, and something that might have been embarrassment. Natalie, he said, his voice carefully controlled but carrying an undercurrent of something I had never heard before. Could you come back to the dining room, please? We need to talk. I walked back to the table on unsteady legs, followed by my mother and Tyler, who were both staring at me as if I had suddenly transformed into a completely different person. The comfortable family dinner setting now felt charged with tension and unspoken questions. My father resumed his seat at the head of the table, but his usual commanding presence seemed diminished somehow, as if the phone call had fundamentally altered the power dynamics that had governed our family interactions for decades. "That was Harrison Wade," he began, speaking slowly and deliberately, as if he were trying to convince himself of the truth of his own words. "He tells me that a company called Brooks Dynamics Corporation has made an offer to acquire Pinnacle Manufacturing Solutions for $65 million. He paused, studying my face for any sign of reaction or explanation. "He also tells me that Brooks Dynamics has been consulting for Pinnacle for the past 6 months, implementing improvements that have already saved the company millions of dollars." Another pause, longer this time. "And he tells me that the CEO of Brooks Dynamics Corporation is a 28-year-old woman named Natalie Brooks." The weight of his gaze was almost unbearable, but I forced myself to meet his eyes directly, knowing that this conversation would define our relationship for years to come. "Is there something you'd like to tell me, Natalie?" he asked, his voice carrying a complexity of emotions that I couldn't begin to untangle. I took a deep breath, realizing that the moment of truth had finally arrived, whether I was ready for it or not. The careful boundaries I had maintained between my professional success and my family relationships were about to disappear forever, and I had no idea what would emerge from the ruins of my carefully constructed double life. The silence stretched between us, heavy with years of misunderstanding, dismissal, and hidden achievements that were about to reshape everything we thought we knew about each other. I looked across the dinner table at my father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in years. The man who had spent decades dismissing my achievements and questioning my competence was now staring at me with an expression of complete bewilderment, as if the fundamental laws of his universe had suddenly been rewritten. "Yes, Dad," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I had expected. "I'm the CEO of Brooks Dynamics Corporation. I have been for the past 5 years." The words hung in the air like a revelation that nobody quite knew how to process. Tyler's jaw had dropped so far I was worried it might actually become dislocated, while my mother's hands flew to cover her mouth in shock. But it was my father's reaction that captured my attention completely. For the first time in my adult life, Richard Brooks looked genuinely speechless. The man who always had an opinion about everything, who never hesitated to share his judgments and criticisms, was sitting in stunned silence as he tried to reconcile the daughter he thought he knew with the successful business executive Harrison Wade had just described. 5 years, he repeated finally, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "You've been running a company for 5 years, and you never told us." "I tried to tell you," I replied, feeling a surge of emotions I had suppressed for far too long. Every week at these dinners, I tried to share what I was working on, what I was accomplishing. But every time I mentioned technology consulting or business transformation, you dismissed it as theoretical nonsense that had no real value. I could see him processing this information, his analytical mind working to reframe years of conversations in light of this new context. "When you said you were working on supply chain management systems, you were talking about actual client projects?" "I was talking about a 12-month engagement with Rocky Mountain Aerospace Components that saved them from bankruptcy and turned them into one of the most efficient suppliers in their sector," I said, my voice gaining strength as I finally had the opportunity to share the truth about my work. "When I mentioned blockchain technology at Christmas, I was describing a system we developed that helps manufacturers track components from source to delivery, eliminating counterfeiting and improving quality control." Tyler found his voice first among my family members. "Wait a minute," he said, leaning forward with intense curiosity. "You're saying you actually own a company? Like with employees and offices and everything?" "Brooks Dynamics employs 37 people across 2 offices," I replied, turning to address my brother directly. "We generate over $8 million in annual revenue, and we've helped dozens of manufacturing companies improve their operations and remain competitive in global markets." The numbers seemed to hit my father like physical blows. I could see him calculating, trying to understand how the daughter he had consistently underestimated could have built something of this magnitude without his knowledge or involvement. $8 million, he repeated slowly. "Natalie, Pinnacle Manufacturing's annual revenue is about $42 million. You're telling me you've built a company that's nearly 20% the size of the business I've spent 25 years helping to develop?" "Actually, Dad, our revenue this year is projected to exceed $12 million, I said, feeling a strange mixture of pride and sadness as I shared achievements that should have been celebrated with family, but had instead been hidden out of fear of his dismissal. "And if the Pinnacle acquisition goes through, Our combined revenue would be approximately $75 million annually. My mother had been silent throughout this exchange, but now she reached across the table to grab my hand. "Honey," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "why didn't you tell us? We're your family. We should have been celebrating your success, not criticizing you for work we didn't understand." "Because every time I tried to explain what I do, Dad made it clear that he thought it was worthless," I replied, looking directly at my father as I spoke. "He spent years telling me that consulting is just elaborate ways of stating the obvious, that technology creates more problems than it solves, and that I've never had a real job or created anything of actual value." The words were harsher than I had intended, but they carried the weight of years of accumulated frustration and hurt. I could see my father flinching as I recounted his own criticisms, perhaps hearing them clearly for the first time and recognizing how dismissive and damaging they had been. "But the improvements at Pinnacle," he said, his voice uncertain as he tried to process this information. "Those efficiency gains in Building C, the new inventory management system, the predictive maintenance protocols that reduce downtime by 60%. You designed all of that? My team and I spent 4 months analyzing your production processes, interviewing employees at every level, and developing integrated solutions that addressed the specific challenges Pinnacle was facing," I explained. "We didn't just install generic software or implement standard procedures. We created custom systems that preserved the institutional knowledge and company culture that makes Pinnacle successful while eliminating the inefficiencies that were making you vulnerable to overseas competition." I could see recognition dawning in his eyes as he began to understand the scope and sophistication of what we had accomplished. The improvements he had witnessed firsthand weren't the result of simple common sense or minor adjustments, but comprehensive transformations that required deep expertise in both technology and manufacturing operations. "The cost savings," he continued, almost talking to himself as he worked through the implications. "Harrison said the improvements were saving us nearly $2 million per quarter. That means your consulting work has already generated $8 million in value for Pinnacle this year alone, which is exactly why we're in a position to make a competitive acquisition offer," Marcus said, speaking for the first time since the revelation began. I hadn't even noticed him entering the dining room, but there he was, standing calmly beside my chair with the kind of quiet confidence that had made him such an effective business partner. My father's eyes widened as he registered Marcus's presence and began to understand his significance. "You're part of this company too?" "I'm the Chief Technology Officer and co-founder of Brooks Dynamics," Marcus replied, extending his hand toward my father in a gesture that seemed to bridge the gap between our professional and personal worlds. "It's good to finally meet you properly, Mr. Brooks. Natalie has told me so much about you over the years." The handshake that followed was awkward, weighted with years of misunderstanding and missed opportunities for connection. But there was something symbolic about it too, a recognition that the relationships and assumptions that had governed our family dynamics were about to change fundamentally. "Mr. Wade called me after your conversation ended," Marcus continued, settling into the chair beside me. "He wanted to schedule a formal meeting for tomorrow morning to discuss the acquisition proposal in detail. He's quite excited about the potential for combining Pinnacle's manufacturing expertise with our operational improvement capabilities." Tyler, who had been listening to this conversation with increasingly wide eyes, finally found his voice again. "So let me get this straight," he said, looking back and forth between me and Marcus. "You two have been running some kind of secret business empire while coming to family dinners and pretending to be normal consultants." "It wasn't secret," I protested, though I knew the distinction was probably meaningless to him. "I just never explained the full scope of what we were doing because every time I tried to discuss my work, the conversation turned into criticism about how consulting wasn't a real job. But you let us think you were barely making ends meet," Tyler continued, his voice carrying a note of accusation. "All those times Dad offered to help you with your rent, or suggested you might want to consider more stable employment, you just sat there and said nothing." The accusation stung because it contained more truth than I wanted to acknowledge. I had allowed my family to maintain their misconceptions about my financial situation, partly to avoid conflict, but also partly because some part of me had enjoyed having information they didn't possess. "I never asked for financial help," I replied defensively. "I never gave you any reason to think I was struggling financially." "But you never corrected our assumptions either," my father said, his voice carrying a complexity of emotions that I couldn't fully decode. "Natalie, do you have any idea how this makes me feel?" I've spent years worrying about your career prospects, offering unsolicited advice about finding more stable employment, questioning whether you were building toward any kind of secure future. You've spent years telling me that my work was meaningless, and that I would never amount to anything in the business world. I shot back, feeling anger and hurt bubbling to the surface, despite my attempts to remain calm. Why would I share my successes with someone who had already decided they weren't worth celebrating? The dining room fell silent as the weight of our mutual misunderstandings settled over the family gathering. I could see pain in my father's eyes, but also something that might have been shame, as he began to recognize how his consistent criticism had created barriers between us that went far deeper than simple disagreements about career choices. The acquisition offer, he said finally, his voice quiet and thoughtful. $65 million. You're serious about that? We're very serious, Marcus replied when I didn't immediately respond. We've done extensive due diligence on Pinnacle's operations, and we believe the company has enormous potential for growth with the right strategic investments and operational improvements. The preliminary offer is based on current valuation, but we see opportunities to significantly increase the company's value over the next 3 to 5 years. What would happen to the current management structure? My father asked, and I could hear the underlying concern in his voice about his own position and the positions of his colleagues who had built their careers at Pinnacle. That would be part of the negotiation process, I said, choosing my words carefully. Our approach isn't to replace existing management, but to provide them with tools and resources that can help them achieve better results. The people who understand Pinnacle's operations and culture are valuable assets, not obstacles to be eliminated. I could see him processing this information, trying to understand what an acquisition by his daughter's company would mean for his own career and professional identity. The power dynamics that had governed our relationship for decades were shifting in ways that none of us had anticipated, creating opportunities for connection, but also potential for new kinds of conflict. This is a lot to process, my mother said finally, her voice carrying the exhaustion that comes from emotional revelations that reshape everything you thought you understood about your family. Natalie, I'm proud of what you've accomplished, but I'm also confused about why you felt you couldn't share it with us. Because I was tired of being dismissed and criticized every time I tried to explain my work, I replied, looking around the table at faces that suddenly seemed like strangers despite years of shared family dinners. Because I was tired of having my achievements minimized and my expertise questioned. Because I was tired of being called a hopeless case. The phrase hung in the air like an accusation, and I could see my father flinch as he recognized his own words being thrown back at him. The man who had spent the evening dismissing my career as meaningless theoretical work was now confronting the reality that his daughter had built a multi-million-dollar company and was in a position to acquire the business where he had spent his entire professional life. The irony was almost overwhelming, but beneath it lay years of hurt feelings, missed opportunities for connection, and fundamental misunderstandings that had shaped our relationship in ways that might take years to fully untangle. The silence that followed my words stretched uncomfortably across the dining room, heavy with the weight of years of accumulated misunderstanding and hurt. I could see my father struggling to process not just the information about Brooks' dynamics, but the deeper implications of how his treatment of me had created the very distance he now seemed desperate to bridge. A hopeless case, he repeated quietly, the words sounding hollow and shameful when spoken back to him. I called you a hopeless case. About 30 minutes ago, I confirmed, my voice steady, despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. Right before your boss called to tell you that the hopeless case wants to buy his company for $65 million. The weight of the irony seemed to settle on his shoulders like a physical burden, and for the first time in my adult life, I saw something in my father's expression that I had never seen before, genuine humility mixed with what appeared to be shame. Marcus cleared his throat gently, drawing attention back to the practical implications of our situation. Mr. Brooks, I know this is a lot to process, but Harrison Wade is expecting a response about tomorrow's meeting. We should probably discuss how we want to handle the professional aspects of this situation. Professional aspects, my father repeated, as if he were learning a foreign language. My daughter wants to buy the company where I work, and we need to discuss the professional aspects. Richard, my mother said softly, reaching across the table to touch his arm. Maybe this is an opportunity to finally understand what Natalie has been trying to tell us all these years. Tyler, who had been silent throughout much of the revelation, suddenly leaned forward with intense curiosity. Nat, can I ask you something? When you bought your apartment in Cherry Creek, when you said you got a good deal on it through work connections. I bought the building, I said simply. Brooks Dynamics owns the entire building where I live. It's part of our real estate investment portfolio. You own a building, he repeated slowly. In Cherry Creek, one of the most expensive neighborhoods in Denver. We own 3 buildings in Cherry Creek. Part 3, the weight of truth. Tyler's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak again. 3 buildings. In Cherry Creek, his voice cracked slightly on the last word, as if the scope of what I was revealing had overwhelmed his ability to process information normally. The real estate investments were Marcus's idea, I explained, glancing at my business partner who nodded encouragingly. When Brooks Dynamics started generating significant revenue, we realized that diversifying our assets would provide stability and additional income streams. Commercial real estate in prime Denver locations seemed like a sound long-term strategy. My father had gone completely pale, his hands gripping the edge of the dining table so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Natalie, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, what exactly is your net worth? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I realized that this moment represented a fundamental shift in our family dynamics that could never be undone. For 28 years, my father had seen himself as the primary breadwinner and financial authority in our family. His identity was built around providing for us, making the important decisions, and maintaining his position as the person everyone else looked to for guidance and security, personally or including business assets. I asked, though I immediately regretted the question, because it sounded like I was showing off rather than simply providing information. Both, he said, though his voice suggested he wasn't sure he actually wanted to know the answer. I took a deep breath, knowing that what I was about to share would fundamentally alter how my family saw me, and potentially how they saw themselves. My personal net worth is approximately $15 million. Brooks Dynamics, as a company, is valued at around $35 million, though that number could increase significantly if we complete the Pinnacle acquisition and integrate the operations successfully. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, and what sounded like Tyler's labored breathing as he tried to comprehend the magnitude of what I had just revealed. My mother was the first to find her voice. $15 million, she repeated slowly, as if testing the words to see if they sounded real when spoken aloud. Natalie, honey, that's more money than your father and I have earned combined in our entire careers. And you've been coming to family dinners, where we argue about whether you're contributing enough to society, Tyler added, his voice carrying a mixture of amazement and something that might have been embarrassment. While you've been sitting there letting Dad lecture you about finding stable employment. My father hadn't spoken since I shared the numbers, and I could see him staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. The man who had always been so confident in his opinions, so certain about what constituted success and failure, was confronting the reality that his fundamental understanding of his own daughter had been completely wrong. How did I not know? He asked finally, his voice hollow with disbelief. How could you build something this significant without me having any idea what was happening? Because every time I tried to share what I was working on, you found ways to dismiss it or minimize it. I replied, trying to keep my voice gentle, despite the years of frustration that threatened to pour out. When I told you about efficiency improvements I was implementing for clients, you said consultants just repackage common sense and charge inflated fees. When I mentioned the revenue growth we were experiencing, you said technology companies were built on unsustainable speculation rather than real value creation. I could see him processing this information, remembering conversations from a different perspective, and perhaps recognizing patterns of dismissal that he hadn't been conscious of at the time. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying the diplomatic tone he used when navigating sensitive client relationships. Mr. Brooks, if I may offer some perspective from someone who's worked closely with Natalie for years, I think part of the communication challenge came from the fact that what she does is genuinely difficult to explain to someone outside the industry. What do you mean? My father asked, looking at Marcus with the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for business discussions. Brooks Dynamics doesn't just implement software or reorganize workflows, Marcus explained. We essentially reimagine how entire organizations function, identifying inefficiencies that have become so embedded in company culture that nobody even recognizes them as problems anymore. It's part detective work, part engineering, part psychology, and part strategic planning. Give me an example, my father said, and I could hear genuine curiosity in his voice for the first time in years. Marcus glanced at me for permission before continuing. When we worked with Rocky Mountain Aerospace Components, they were losing money on nearly every contract because their quality control processes required them to inspect every component multiple times at different stages of production. The inspections were catching defects, but the cost of the labor and the delays in production were making them uncompetitive. So what did you do? Tyler asked, clearly engaged despite his earlier confusion. We developed an integrated quality management system that used sensors and automated testing to monitor production in real time. Instead of inspecting finished components, we monitored the manufacturing process continuously and made adjustments before defects could occur. It reduced their quality control costs by 70% while actually improving their defect detection rates. My father was nodding slowly, and I could see his analytical mind working to understand the complexity of what we had accomplished. That's not just installing software, he said, almost to himself. That's completely rethinking how production works. Exactly, Marcus confirmed. And every client presents different challenges that require custom solutions. We're not selling products, we're selling expertise and problem-solving capabilities that have to be developed fresh for each situation. Which is why it was so frustrating to have my work dismissed as playing with computers or moving numbers around on spreadsheets. I added, feeling some of the defensive anger I had carried for years beginning to surface. What we do requires deep understanding of manufacturing processes, financial systems, organizational psychology, and technology integration. It's not theoretical work, Dad. It's incredibly practical work that solves real problems for real companies. My father was quiet for a long moment, staring at the tablecloth as if it contained answers to questions he was just beginning to formulate. When he looked up, his expression was more vulnerable than I had ever seen it. I owe you an apology, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Not just for tonight, but for years of not listening to you, not trying to understand what you were doing, and not recognizing your accomplishments. I was wrong, Natalie. I was completely wrong about everything. The words hit me harder than I had expected, and I felt tears pricking at the corners of my eyes despite my efforts to maintain composure. This was the acknowledgement I had craved for years, but hearing it now felt both vindicating and heartbreaking because of all the time we had lost to misunderstanding. Why? I asked, my voice barely steady. Why was it so difficult for you to believe that I might be successful at something you didn't immediately understand? He was quiet for a long time, clearly struggling with the question and the self-reflection it required. I think, he said finally, I was threatened by the idea that success could look different from what I had achieved. My career at Pinnacle has been the foundation of my identity for 25 years. I understood manufacturing, I understood traditional business models, and I understood the kind of work that produced tangible results you could see and touch. And my work seemed abstract, I said, beginning to understand the psychological dynamics that had driven his criticism. More than abstract, he admitted. It seemed to suggest that the way I had been doing things, the way my entire industry had been operating, was somehow outdated or insufficient. When you talked about transforming manufacturing through technology, part of me heard that as criticism of everything I had built my career on. Tyler had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding. So you were defending your own approach to work by dismissing hers, he said, his voice carrying a note of recognition. Even though they weren't actually in competition with each other. That's exactly right, my father said, looking at Tyler with surprise at his insight. I created a false opposition between traditional manufacturing expertise and technology consulting, when the reality is that they should complement each other. Which is exactly what we've proven at Pinnacle, Marcus interjected. The improvements we've implemented work specifically because they preserve and enhance the institutional knowledge that people like you have developed over decades of experience. We're not trying to replace human expertise with technology, we're trying to amplify it. I could see my father processing this information, reframing our work not as a threat to his worldview but as a validation of it. The efficiency improvements at Pinnacle hadn't succeeded despite the experience of longtime employees, but because our systems had been designed to leverage and enhance that experience. The acquisition offer, he said suddenly, his tone shifting back toward business mode. If Brooks Dynamics acquires Pinnacle, what happens to the current management team? That depends partly on what the current management team wants to happen, I replied carefully. Our typical approach is to retain existing leadership and provide them with better tools and resources to achieve their goals. We're not interested in dismantling organizations that work. We're interested in helping them work better. But I would be reporting to you, he said, the reality of the situation clearly sinking in. My daughter would become my boss. The weight of that statement settled over the dining room like a heavy blanket. For a man who had spent his entire career in positions of authority, the idea of reporting to his daughter represented a fundamental reversal of the family power dynamics that had existed since my birth. Actually, Marcus said, glancing at me before continuing. We've discussed the organizational structure extensively, and we think Richard would be an ideal candidate for Senior Vice President of Manufacturing Operations. It would be a promotion from his current position, with significantly more authority, and a substantial increase in compensation. My father's eyes widened as he processed this information. A promotion. Dad, you have 25 years of experience at Pinnacle and deep relationships throughout the industry, I explained. If we acquire the company, your expertise becomes one of our most valuable assets. We need someone who understands the culture and history of the organization to help guide the integration process. You're offering me a promotion, he repeated, his voice filled with wonder as if the concept were completely foreign to him. We're offering you the opportunity to help lead the transformation of Pinnacle into something even more successful than it already is, I said. You'd be working directly with our team to implement improvements that could position Pinnacle as an industry leader for the next decade. Tyler had been following this conversation with increasing excitement. Wait, so instead of Dad being stuck in the same position he's held for years, he'd actually have more responsibility and authority than he's ever had. Significantly more, Marcus confirmed. The Senior VP of Manufacturing Operations would oversee not just Pinnacle's current operations, but also the implementation of new technologies and processes across all our manufacturing clients. It would essentially be a regional leadership position within our expanded organization. My mother had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement. Richard, she said softly, this could be the opportunity you've been waiting for. You've always said you wanted more influence over strategic decisions. But it means working for Natalie, he said, though his tone was more contemplative than resistant. It means acknowledging that my daughter has built something more successful than anything I've achieved. It means working with me, I corrected gently. Dad, I've never wanted to compete with you or diminish what you've accomplished. I've always wanted your respect and approval for what I was building. This acquisition isn't about proving that I'm better than you. It's about combining your expertise with our capabilities to create something neither of us could achieve alone. I could see him struggling with concepts that challenged fundamental assumptions about success, authority, and family dynamics that had shaped his worldview for decades. But I could also see curiosity and perhaps even excitement as he began to imagine possibilities that hadn't existed 30 minutes earlier. What would be my salary in this new position? He asked, his practical nature asserting itself despite the emotional complexity of the situation. Marcus pulled out his phone and opened a document we had prepared weeks earlier as part of our acquisition planning. The senior VP position would start at $250,000 annually, plus performance bonuses that could add another $50,000 to $75,000 depending on the success of integration milestones. The number hung in the air like a revelation. My father's current salary at Pinnacle was approximately $120,000, which meant we were offering him more than double his current compensation along with significantly expanded responsibilities and authority. $250,000, my mother repeated, her voice filled with amazement. Richard, that's more than you ever imagined earning. It's more than I thought was possible without starting my own company, he admitted, his voice carrying a mixture of excitement and disbelief. The offer reflects the value we place on your experience and the critical role you would play in making the acquisition successful, I explained. We're not just buying Pinnacle's assets, Dad. We're investing in the people who understand how to make those assets productive. Tyler was shaking his head in amazement. So let me get this straight. Natalie went from being the family disappointment to offering Dad the biggest promotion of his career, all in the space of one phone call. I was never the family disappointment, I said, my voice carrying more edge than I had intended. I was the family member whose accomplishments weren't recognized or valued. The distinction was important to me, even though I knew it might sound like semantics to everyone else. I had never failed at anything significant. I had simply succeeded at things my family didn't understand or appreciate. You're right, my father said quietly. You were never a disappointment. I was just too stubborn and too threatened to see what you were actually achieving. The acknowledgement meant more to me than I had expected, and I felt some of the defensive anger I had carried for years beginning to dissipate. This conversation wasn't erasing the hurt of those years of dismissal, but it was creating space for a different kind of relationship to emerge. So what happens next? My mother asked, her practical nature asserting itself as she tried to understand the logistics of this dramatic change in our family circumstances. Tomorrow morning we meet with Harrison Wade to formalize the acquisition discussions, Marcus said. If everyone agrees to move forward, we'll begin the due diligence process and work toward a formal agreement. And if the acquisition goes through, when would the organizational changes take effect? My father asked. Typically these transitions take 3 to 6 months to complete, I replied. There are regulatory approvals required, financial audits to conduct, and integration planning that needs to happen before any major organizational changes can be implemented. 3 to 6 months, he repeated thoughtfully. That's enough time to get used to the idea of working for my daughter. Working with your daughter, I corrected again, though I was smiling as I said it. For the first time since the phone call had interrupted our dinner, my father smiled back. It was a tentative smile, weighted with years of misunderstanding that would take time to fully resolve, but it was genuine and warm in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in years. Working with my daughter, the CEO, he said, testing the words as if he were learning a new language. I think I'm going to need some time to adjust to that concept. We all are, my mother said softly, reaching across the table to squeeze both of our hands. But I think it might be the best thing that's happened to this family in a very long time. As I sat there, surrounded by family members who were seeing me clearly for perhaps the first time in years, I realized that the success I had worked so hard to achieve was about to create possibilities I had never imagined. Not just for Brooks Dynamics or for Pinnacle Manufacturing, but for relationships that had been constrained by misunderstanding and assumptions that no longer had any foundation in reality. The conversation was far from over, and the practical challenges of navigating a business relationship with my father would undoubtedly create new complications. But for the first time in years, I felt hopeful that we might actually be able to build something together that honored both his experience and my vision for what manufacturing could become in the 21st century. Part 4. The morning after the next morning arrived with an unexpected sense of anticipation that I hadn't felt in years. For the first time since building Brooks Dynamics, I was facing a business meeting where my personal and professional worlds would be completely integrated rather than carefully separated. The prospect was both exhilarating and terrifying in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. I arrived at the Pinnacle Manufacturing headquarters building 30 minutes early, sitting in my car in the visitor parking lot as I tried to process the surreal nature of what was about to happen. This was the building where my father had worked for over 2 decades, where he had built his career and established his professional identity. In less than an hour, I would be walking into his workplace as a potential buyer rather than as his daughter visiting for the company holiday party. Marcus pulled into the parking space beside me, stepping out of his Tesla with the same calm confidence he brought to every important business meeting. Over the years, I had come to rely on his ability to remain focused on practical objectives even when situations became emotionally complex, and I knew I would need that steadiness today more than ever. "How are you feeling?" he asked as we walked toward the main entrance, our footsteps echoing off the concrete in the crisp October morning air. "Like I'm about to have the most important business meeting of my career with my father sitting across the table," I replied, adjusting my blazer and checking my reflection in the glass doors. "It's not exactly a scenario they cover in business school. Just remember that you've earned your place at this table," Marcus said, his voice carrying the kind of supportive certainty that had helped me navigate countless challenging client situations. "Everything you've built with Brooks Dynamics has led to this moment. The fact that your father works here is almost incidental to the business case for this acquisition." Almost incidental. The phrase was both comforting and jarring because it highlighted the strange duality of the situation. From a purely business perspective, the Pinnacle acquisition made perfect sense regardless of my family connections. But the personal implications were anything but incidental, and I knew they would color every aspect of the negotiations that were about to unfold. The Pinnacle reception area was exactly as I remembered it from previous visits, all polished marble and corporate artwork that projected stability and success without being ostentatious. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair, greeted us with professional warmth. "Miss Brooks and Mr. Thompson for Harrison Wade," I said, though using my last name in this context felt strange given that Brooks was also my father's name, and the name of at least 3 other employees currently working in the building. Wade is expecting you, she replied, gesturing toward the elevator bank. Conference room A on the 7th floor. I believe Mr. Richard Brooks will be joining you as well. Hearing my father referred to as Mr. Richard Brooks by someone else crystallized the oddness of the situation in a way that made me slightly lightheaded. In this building, he was a respected executive with 25 years of institutional knowledge and established relationships. I was the outsider, despite being family, despite having worked as a consultant for the company for months without his knowledge. The elevator ride to the 7th floor felt simultaneously too long and too short, giving me time to rehearse key points I wanted to make while also amplifying my anxiety about how the family dynamics might affect the business discussions. When the doors opened, I could see Harrison Wade waiting in the hallway, his expression combining professional courtesy with obvious curiosity about how this unusual situation would unfold. Natalie Marcus, thank you for coming, he said, extending his hand and gesturing toward the conference room. I have to admit, this is one of the most interesting meetings I've arranged in 30 years of business. The conference room was spacious and well-appointed, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of downtown Denver and the Rocky Mountains beyond. Under normal circumstances, I would have found the setting impressive and conducive to productive negotiations. But as I took my seat at the polished mahogany table, all I could think about was the fact that my father would be walking through that door at any moment, and our relationship would never be quite the same after this meeting concluded. I should mention, Harrison continued, as we settled into our chairs and opened our laptops, that Richard asked to review your preliminary proposal before this meeting. I hope you don't mind that I shared the executive summary with him yesterday evening. Of course not, Marcus replied, though I could hear a slight tension in his voice that suggested he was wondering how my father had reacted to seeing the details of our acquisition plans. We're committed to transparency throughout this process. He was quite impressed, Harrison said, and I felt an unexpected surge of pride at this second-hand acknowledgement from my father. He said the operational analysis was more thorough than anything he'd seen from other consulting firms, and he was particularly interested in your projections for efficiency improvements. Before I could respond, the conference room door opened and my father entered, looking more formal and businesslike than I had ever seen him. He was wearing his best suit, his hair was perfectly styled, and he carried himself with the kind of professional gravitas that reminded me why he had been successful in his career despite his limitations in understanding emerging technologies. Good morning, everyone, he said, his voice carrying no trace of the emotional vulnerability he had shown at dinner the night before. Harrison Natalie Marcus. The way he said my name was different from how he had ever said it before, with a formality that acknowledged our new professional relationship while maintaining appropriate boundaries. I realized that he was trying to navigate the same complex dynamics I was facing, attempting to separate his role as my father from his responsibilities as a Pinnacle executive. Richard, please have a seat, Harrison said, gesturing to the chair across from me. I thought it would be valuable to have your perspective on the operational aspects of this proposal, given your extensive experience with our manufacturing processes. As my father settled into his chair and arranged his notepad and pen with characteristic precision, I caught his eye for just a moment and saw something I hadn't expected: respect. Not the grudging acknowledgement of someone who had been forced to revise their opinions, but genuine professional respect for what Marcus and I had accomplished and the thoroughness of our acquisition proposal. Shall we begin with an overview of your strategic vision for Pinnacle? Harrison asked, opening his leather portfolio and preparing to take notes. I took a deep breath and activated the first slide of our presentation, feeling the familiar surge of confidence that came from discussing business strategy with people who understood the complexity of what we were proposing. Brooks Dynamics sees Pinnacle Manufacturing as the cornerstone of a comprehensive approach to transforming American manufacturing. I began, my voice steady and authoritative despite the personal complexity of the situation. Your company has built an exceptional reputation for quality and reliability, but we believe there are opportunities to dramatically expand that success through strategic investments in technology integration and operational optimization. The next 45 minutes unfolded like any other high-stakes business presentation, with Marcus and I walking through detailed financial projections, operational improvement plans, and growth strategies that would position Pinnacle as an industry leader for the next decade. But underneath the professional discussion, I was acutely aware of my father's reactions to each point we made, watching his expressions shift from skepticism to interest to what appeared to be genuine excitement. The efficiency improvements you've already implemented in Building C, I continued, clicking to a slide that showed productivity metrics from our pilot project, demonstrate the potential for scaling these approaches across all manufacturing operations. We project that comprehensive implementation could reduce overall production costs by 38% while improving quality metrics by 25%. My father leaned forward slightly, studying the charts with the intense focus he brought to any discussion of manufacturing efficiency. These numbers are based on actual performance data from the pilot project, he asked, his voice carrying the analytical skepticism that had made him effective in his role at Pinnacle. Absolutely, Marcus replied, pulling up a detailed spreadsheet on his laptop. Every projection is extrapolated from documented improvements we've achieved in Building C over the past 6 months. We don't make promises we can't deliver on. And the timeline for implementation across the entire facility? Harrison asked, making notes as he spoke. Phase 1 would take approximately 8 months and focus on the core production areas where we can achieve the highest impact. I explained, advancing to the next slide. Phase 2 would address support systems and administrative processes over an additional 6 months. Full integration would be complete within 18 months of acquisition closing. The discussion continued with increasingly technical questions about integration challenges, employee training requirements, and quality assurance protocols. I found myself impressed by my father's depth of knowledge about Pinnacle's operations and his ability to identify potential complications that Marcus and I hadn't fully considered in our planning. The supply chain optimization you're proposing, he said, pointing to a complex flow chart on the projection screen, that would require renegotiating contracts with 17 different vendors. Some of those relationships go back decades, and the vendors have made significant investments in equipment and processes specifically to meet our requirements. Which is exactly why we need someone with your institutional knowledge to guide that process, I replied, realizing that this was the perfect opportunity to discuss his potential role in the acquisition. The vendor relationships you've developed represent enormous value that we want to preserve and enhance, not disrupt. Harrison Wade had been listening to this exchange with obvious satisfaction, and I could see him beginning to understand how my father's expertise would complement our technological capabilities. Richard, you've been advocating for operational improvements for years. This proposal seems to address many of the challenges you've identified. It addresses all of them, my father replied, his voice carrying a note of amazement. Natalie and Marcus have identified inefficiencies I've been trying to solve for the past 5 years, and they've developed comprehensive solutions that I wouldn't have thought possible. The acknowledgement was more meaningful than I had expected, representing the first time my father had publicly recognized my professional expertise in front of other business colleagues. But more than that, it suggested genuine collaboration possibilities that went beyond the formal reporting structures we had discussed the night before. Which brings us to the organizational structure question, Marcus said, seamlessly transitioning to the topic that I knew would be most sensitive for everyone involved. We see this acquisition as an opportunity to combine Pinnacle's manufacturing expertise with Brooks Dynamics' operational optimization capabilities. Meaning what, specifically? Harrison asked, though I suspected he already knew where the conversation was heading. Meaning we want Richard to play a central role in leading the transformation, I said, looking directly at my father as I spoke. We're proposing to create a new position of Senior Vice President of Manufacturing Operations that would oversee not just Pinnacle's production but also the implementation of optimization projects for all Brooks Dynamics manufacturing clients. The silence that followed was charged with possibility and uncertainty in equal measure. I could see my father processing the implications of what I was offering, while Harrison Wade was clearly trying to understand how family relationships might affect professional decision-making. You're offering me a promotion, my father said finally, his voice carefully controlled but carrying an undercurrent of emotion. We're offering you the opportunity to help lead the next phase of American manufacturing, I replied. Your experience at Pinnacle combined with our technological capabilities could transform how mid-sized manufacturers compete in global markets. Harrison Wade was nodding slowly, and I could see him beginning to appreciate the strategic value of retaining Pinnacle's existing leadership while bringing in new capabilities. Richard, you've consistently demonstrated the kind of operational insight that would be invaluable for this type of expansion. The compensation structure we're proposing reflects the scope of the responsibility, Marcus added, pulling up a document on his laptop. The senior VP position would start at $250,000 annually, with performance incentives that could add another $50,000 to $75,000 based on successful integration milestones. I watched my father's eyes widen slightly as he processed the financial implications of what we were offering. In one conversation, we were proposing to more than double his salary while giving him authority and influence that extended far beyond his current role at Pinnacle. "This is a lot to consider," he said, though his tone suggested interest rather than reluctance. "The scope of responsibility you're describing is significantly broader than anything I've done before, which is exactly why we think you're the right person for it," I replied. "You understand manufacturing operations from the ground up, you have relationships throughout the industry, and you've seen firsthand how our optimization approaches can improve efficiency and profitability." Harrison Wade had been taking notes throughout this discussion, and now he set down his pen and looked around the table with obvious satisfaction. "I have to say, this conversation has exceeded my expectations. The combination of Brooks Dynamics' growth trajectory with Pinnacle's operational stability could create something truly exceptional. Are you prepared to move forward with formal due diligence?" Marcus asked, shifting the conversation toward practical next steps. "Absolutely," Harrison replied without hesitation. "Based on what I've seen today, I think this acquisition could benefit everyone involved. Richard, I assume you'll want some time to consider the position we've discussed." My father was quiet for a moment, and I could see him weighing professional opportunities against personal complications in ways that were probably unfamiliar to him. "Actually," he said finally, "I don't think I need additional time. If Brooks Dynamics is serious about this acquisition, and if Natalie is comfortable with the professional relationship we'd be establishing, then I'm interested in the senior VP position." The words hit me with unexpected force, representing not just his acceptance of a job offer but acknowledgement of my professional credibility in a way that felt like vindication of years of dismissed achievements. This wasn't just my father agreeing to work for his daughter's company. This was an experienced manufacturing executive recognizing that what I had built was valuable enough to bet his own career on. "Then I think we have the foundation for moving forward," Harrison said, closing his portfolio with obvious satisfaction. "I'll have our legal team prepare the preliminary agreements for due diligence, and we can schedule follow-up meetings to address the technical details." As the formal meeting concluded and we began gathering our materials, I felt a strange mixture of professional triumph and personal relief. The acquisition that had seemed impossibly complicated because of family dynamics was actually proceeding more smoothly than many purely business transactions I had negotiated. "Natalie," my father said as we prepared to leave the conference room, "could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Marcus and Harrison Wade excused themselves, leaving us alone in the conference room with its panoramic views of the city where we had both built our careers in such different ways. "I owe you more than an apology," he said, his voice carrying the kind of vulnerability that had emerged during our dinner conversation the night before. "I owe you recognition for what you've accomplished and respect for the expertise you've developed." "Dad, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted gently. "For years I've dismissed your work because I didn't understand it, and because it threatened my assumptions about what success should look like. But sitting in that meeting, listening to you present strategic plans that could transform this entire industry, I realized that you've become exactly the kind of business leader I always hoped you might become. You just did it in ways I was too stubborn to recognize." The acknowledgement was everything I had wanted to hear for years, but hearing it now felt both gratifying and bittersweet because of all the time we had lost to misunderstanding. "I want this to work," he continued. "Not just the acquisition, but the working relationship. I want to learn from you the way you've already learned from people like me who understand traditional manufacturing. I think we could build something together that neither of us could achieve alone." As I looked at my father standing in that conference room, I realized that the success I had worked so hard to achieve was creating possibilities I had never imagined. Not just for Brooks Dynamics or for Pinnacle Manufacturing, but for a relationship that had been constrained by assumptions and misunderstandings that no longer had any foundation in reality. "I want that too," I said, meaning it completely. "I've always wanted that." Part 5. The new foundation. 6 months later, I stood in the executive conference room of the newly renovated Pinnacle Manufacturing headquarters, watching my father lead a presentation to the board of directors about quarterly efficiency improvements that had exceeded every projection we had made during the acquisition negotiations. The transformation had been more successful than anyone had dared to hope, but more importantly, it had created a working relationship between us that neither of us could have imagined during those contentious family dinners. The acquisition had closed in January after a due diligence process that revealed Pinnacle to be even more valuable than our initial assessments had suggested. Harrison Wade had negotiated favorable terms that protected existing employees while providing Brooks Dynamics with the operational control necessary to implement comprehensive improvements. The final purchase price had been $72 million, reflecting additional value we discovered in Pinnacle's intellectual property portfolio and customer relationships. Production efficiency in the primary manufacturing facility has increased by 43% since implementation began, my father was saying, his voice carrying the confident authority of someone who had found his ideal professional role. Quality metrics have improved by 31%, and customer satisfaction scores have reached the highest levels in company history. Watching him present these results to a room full of industry executives and board members, I felt a deep sense of pride that went beyond the financial success of the acquisition. Richard Brooks had not just adapted to his new role as Senior Vice President of Manufacturing Operations, he had thrived in ways that validated every assumption Marcus and I had made about the value of combining his institutional knowledge with our technological capabilities. The integration process had not been without challenges. The first few months had required careful navigation of family dynamics in professional settings, establishing clear boundaries between our personal relationship and our working partnership. We had developed protocols for handling disagreements that might arise from both business strategy differences and residual family tensions, and we had been deliberately transparent with other employees about our relationship to prevent speculation or rumors that might undermine team morale. But those early challenges had given way to a collaboration that was producing results beyond anything either of us had achieved independently. My father's deep understanding of manufacturing culture and processes had helped us avoid implementation mistakes that could have derailed the transformation, while our technological expertise had enabled him to solve operational problems that had frustrated him for years. The supply chain optimization project has reduced inventory carrying costs by 28%, while improving delivery reliability to 97%, he continued, advancing to the next slide in his presentation. These improvements have positioned Pinnacle as the preferred supplier for 3 major automotive manufacturers that were previously working with overseas competitors. The automotive contracts represented a particularly significant victory because they validated our strategic thesis that American manufacturers could compete effectively with international suppliers by leveraging technology to achieve superior efficiency and quality. The contracts were worth approximately $15 million annually and provided the kind of stable long-term revenue that would fund continued expansion of our optimization capabilities. Marcus caught my eye from across the conference room and nodded toward the financial projections displayed on the screen. The numbers were impressive by any measure, but they were especially meaningful because they represented the successful integration of 2 different approaches to business that had once seemed incompatible. Traditional manufacturing expertise and cutting-edge technology consulting had proven to be powerfully complementary rather than competitive. After the board meeting concluded and the directors had departed with expressions of satisfaction and approval, my father approached me with the kind of easy familiarity that had developed between us over months of working together on complex projects. The automotive contracts put us ahead of schedule for the revenue targets we set during the acquisition planning, he said, pulling up a spreadsheet on his tablet that showed our actual performance compared to original projections. If we maintain this trajectory, Brooks Dynamics could achieve the expansion goals we outlined for the next 3 years within 18 months, which creates interesting opportunities for additional acquisitions, I replied, thinking about the pipeline of potential targets we had been evaluating as our success with Pinnacle had attracted attention from other manufacturing companies facing similar competitive pressures. Mountain West Precision Components has been asking about our services, he said, referring to a Colorado-based manufacturer that produced specialized parts for aerospace and defense contractors. Their CEO reached out to Harrison Wade last week, asking if we might be interested in a consulting engagement similar to what we did with Pinnacle. Or a potential acquisition, Marcus added, joining our conversation as other meeting participants filed out of the conference room. Mountain West has annual revenue of about $35 million, and their operational challenges are very similar to what we solved here. It could be an ideal candidate for our expansion strategy. The possibility of additional acquisitions represented the natural evolution of what we had built, but it also raised questions about how quickly we wanted to scale and whether we could maintain the quality of our transformation approach while managing multiple simultaneous projects. Success had created options that required careful strategic thinking, rather than simply pursuing every opportunity that presented itself. We should probably schedule a formal strategy session to evaluate the expansion possibilities, I said, thinking about the complex decisions that would shape the next phase of our company's development. But I want to make sure we don't sacrifice the quality of our work for the sake of rapid growth. Agreed, my father said, and I was struck by how naturally he had adopted the collaborative decision-making approach that Marcus and I had developed over years of partnership. The success we've achieved with Pinnacle came from taking the time to understand the organization deeply before implementing changes. We don't want to lose that thoroughness by trying to do too much too quickly. As we gathered our materials and prepared to leave the conference room, I reflected on how dramatically our professional and personal relationships had evolved since that transformative dinner conversation 6 months earlier. The man who had once dismissed my work as theoretical nonsense was now my closest collaborator in building an integrated approach to manufacturing transformation that was attracting attention throughout the industry. But the changes extended beyond our working relationship. The family dynamics that had been strained by years of misunderstanding and criticism had been fundamentally altered by the recognition and respect that had emerged from our business partnership. Sunday dinners at my parents' house had become celebrations of shared achievements rather than exercises in defensive conversation management. Tyler had benefited from these changes as well, finding his own place in our evolving family dynamic without the pressure of mediating between conflicting perspectives about success and career choices. He had been promoted to shop supervisor at Morrison Automotive and was considering pursuing additional training in advanced diagnostic systems, inspired by seeing how technology integration had transformed manufacturing at Pinnacle. My mother had perhaps experienced the most dramatic change in her role within our family structure. For decades she had served as a peacekeeper, trying to smooth over the tensions between my father and me, while avoiding direct confrontation about the underlying issues that created those tensions. With those conflicts resolved through mutual respect and shared goals, she had been able to express pride in all of her children without worrying about creating jealousy or competition. Natalie, my father said, as we walked toward the elevator that would take us back to our respective offices, I wanted to mention that I've been invited to speak at the National Manufacturing Association conference next month. They want me to present a case study about operational transformation through technology integration. That's fantastic, I replied, genuinely pleased that his expertise was gaining recognition beyond our immediate business circle. The NMA conference is one of the most prestigious events in the industry. I was hoping you and Marcus might consider co-presenting with me, he continued, his tone suggesting that this was more than just a professional courtesy. The story of how we achieved these results is really the story of combining traditional manufacturing knowledge with advanced consulting methodologies. I think it would be more compelling if all three of us told it together. The invitation represented something significant beyond the professional opportunity it presented. My father was asking me to share a platform where he would be recognized for his expertise, acknowledging that our success had been genuinely collaborative, rather than simply his adaptation to my company's approach. I think that would be an excellent opportunity to showcase what we've accomplished, Marcus said, clearly understanding the broader implications of what my father was proposing. It would also help establish Brooks' dynamics as a thought leader in the manufacturing transformation space. As we reached the elevator and prepared to return to our daily responsibilities, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond the financial success we had achieved or the industry recognition we were receiving. The acquisition of Pinnacle Manufacturing had accomplished something I hadn't fully anticipated when we began the process. It had created a foundation for relationships and collaborations that honored both where we had come from and where we were going. The weeks that followed brought a steady stream of opportunities and challenges that tested our ability to maintain the balance we had achieved between rapid growth and operational excellence. Mountain West Precision Components formally requested a consulting engagement that would likely lead to acquisition discussions. 2 other Colorado manufacturers inquired about similar partnerships, and we received an invitation to present our methodology to a consortium of manufacturing executives from across the Mountain West region. But perhaps the most meaningful development came during a routine strategy meeting, when my father suggested that we formalize our collaboration approach by establishing an Institute for Manufacturing Excellence that would combine Brooks Dynamics consulting capabilities with Pinnacle's operational expertise to provide training and certification programs for other manufacturers. The requests we're receiving suggest there's enormous demand for the kind of transformation we've achieved, he said, presenting a proposal he had obviously spent considerable time developing. Rather than just working with individual companies, we could create educational programs that help entire industries adapt to the technological changes that are reshaping global manufacturing. The institute concept represented exactly the kind of visionary thinking that had been missing from our acquisition planning, but that could dramatically amplify our impact on American manufacturing competitiveness. Instead of simply growing through additional acquisitions, we could build a platform for sharing knowledge and methodologies that would benefit companies regardless of whether they became Brooks Dynamics clients. The training programs could generate revenue, while also creating a pipeline of potential consulting clients, Marcus added, clearly excited by the strategic possibilities the Institute would create. And it would position us as thought leaders, rather than just service providers. More importantly, I said, beginning to understand the full scope of what my father was proposing, it would create a sustainable model for preserving and enhancing the kind of manufacturing expertise that you represent while integrating it with emerging technologies. The conversation continued for over 2 hours, as we explored the practical implications of establishing the Institute, from curriculum development to facility requirements, to partnerships with universities and industry associations. By the end of the meeting, we had outlined a comprehensive plan that would launch the Institute for Manufacturing Excellence within 18 months, with my father serving as executive director and Marcus and I providing strategic oversight and technological expertise. 3 months later, we announced the Institute at the National Manufacturing Association Conference, where my father Marcus and I delivered a joint presentation about the Pinnacle transformation that received a standing ovation from an audience of over 800 industry executives. The response exceeded our most optimistic expectations, with dozens of companies expressing interest in both consulting services and Institute programs. But the moment that defined the entire experience for me came during the question and answer session, when a manufacturing executive from Phoenix asked about the challenges of integrating different generations of expertise within rapidly changing industries. The key insight, my father replied, looking directly at me as he spoke, is recognizing that experience and innovation are not competitive forces, but complementary capabilities that become exponentially more powerful when they're combined effectively. He paused, and I could see him choosing his words carefully, as he prepared to share something more personal than the business case studies we had been presenting. For too many years, I viewed my daughter's expertise in technology consulting as a threat to the traditional approaches that had defined my career, he continued, his voice carrying the kind of vulnerability that commands attention from large audiences. I was wrong about that, and my resistance to her innovations delayed our ability to achieve the kind of transformation that has made Pinnacle Manufacturing more successful than it has ever been. The admission was public acknowledgement of insights that had emerged through our private conversations, but sharing them in this context transformed personal growth into professional wisdom that could benefit other leaders facing similar challenges. The most important lesson we've learned, I added, taking over the narrative in a way that felt completely natural, is that sustainable innovation requires deep respect for existing expertise, combined with willingness to challenge assumptions about how things have always been done. The conference presentation became a catalyst for opportunities that extended far beyond anything we had anticipated when we first began exploring the Pinnacle acquisition. Universities began reaching out about curriculum partnerships, government agencies inquired about consulting support for manufacturing competitiveness initiatives, and international companies expressed interest in licensing our methodologies for implementation in other countries. But as I reflected on everything that had changed since that evening, when my father called me a hopeless case, I realized that the most meaningful transformation had been the reconstruction of our relationship from one based on misunderstanding and criticism to one grounded in mutual respect and shared vision. The financial success of Brooks Dynamics had provided security and opportunities that exceeded my ambitious projections, but the personal satisfaction of building something meaningful with my father had created a sense of completion that no amount of individual achievement could have provided. 6 months after the NMA conference, we officially launched the Institute for Manufacturing Excellence in a ceremony attended by industry leaders, government officials, and university partners, who recognized the potential for our approach to strengthen American manufacturing competitiveness. My father's opening remarks as executive director captured the essence of what we had accomplished together. Excellence in manufacturing, he said, addressing an audience that included many of the executives who had once shared his skepticism about technology consulting, emerges from the intersection of proven expertise and innovative thinking. It requires leaders who understand both where their industries have been and where they need to go. As I listened to him speak with the authority that comes from hard-won wisdom, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. The daughter who had been dismissed as a hopeless case had become the architect of a transformation that was reshaping how traditional industries approached the challenges of global competition. But more importantly, the father who had struggled to understand his daughter's work had become her most effective collaborator in building something that honored both tradition and innovation. The success we had achieved together validated everything I had believed about the potential for technology to enhance rather than replace human expertise, but it also demonstrated the power of persistence in relationships that seem broken beyond repair. The years of dismissed achievements and critical family dinners had been transformed into the foundation for collaboration that was creating value no individual effort could have produced. As the launch ceremony concluded, and we mingled with attendees who were eager to discuss partnership opportunities and program enrollment, I caught my father's eye across the crowded reception hall. He smiled and raised his champagne glass in a subtle toast that acknowledged not just our professional accomplishments, but the personal journey that had made them possible. Later that evening, as our family gathered for dinner at my parents' house to celebrate the Institute launch, Tyler asked a question that captured the significance of what had transpired over the past year. "Do you think this would have happened if Dad hadn't called you a hopeless case that night?" he said, grinning, as he posed the question that had probably occurred to all of us at various times. "Probably not," I replied honestly, thinking about how the phone call that interrupted that dinner had forced revelations that might have remained hidden for years under different circumstances. Sometimes it takes a crisis to create the conditions for breakthrough. Sometimes it takes someone willing to admit they were wrong, my father added, his voice carrying the self-awareness that had enabled our collaboration to flourish. And someone else willing to forgive that wrongness and work towards something better. As I looked around the dinner table at faces that reflected pride, affection, and genuine respect for what each of us had contributed to our shared success, I realized that the transformation we had achieved extended far beyond business metrics or industry recognition. We had reconstructed our relationships based on accurate understanding rather than flawed assumptions, creating space for each person to contribute their strengths without having to diminish anyone else's achievements. The hopeless case had become the catalyst for changes that strengthened not just a business, but an entire family structure that had been constrained by misunderstanding for far too long. The success I had worked so hard to achieve had finally created the recognition I had craved, but more importantly, it had created opportunities for collaboration that honored everyone's contributions while building something none of us could have accomplished alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.